Vad sjukt alltså. Herre. So the brand new Sony ZV-E1 is a full-frame vlogging camera and pretty far from a traditional wildlife camera. But I wanted to try it out on some wildlife videography to see if this thing is worth getting for that specific purpose. And I got this camera 1 week ago and I've been doing my absolute best to try and find wildlife to shoot with it. And believe it or not, wildlife photography is not something you can do in a speed run. But I dedicated the whole last week to just trying to find nature and wildlife to capture with this thing. And I got to try it out in many different lighting conditions and many different scenarios. And I can tell you one thing, I will 100% buy this camera after I've returned it to Sony. And in this little review video, I will tell you exactly why. So if you don't know, this camera was just announced and it's equipped with the same 12 megapixel sensor as the low light king and filmmaking king, the Sony a7S III. Which means we should be able to get the same crazy good video capabilities, but in a smaller sized camera body. So if we take a look at the design of this thing, it reminds me of the A7C quite a lot, which I'm filming this on. So we have the regular wheel on the back that we are familiar with, as well as the other 4 buttons that usually are on the Sony Alpha cameras. The one thing we don't have is the joystick, which I usually enjoy very much. We also have the wheel for the thumb on the back side, which I have set to change the aperture. But as with all Sony cameras, you can change the dials and buttons to do basically what you want, which is really nice. So the record button is on top, and beside it we have the C1, as well as the mode switch. And I actually think this design of the switch is pretty nice and convenient to use, and I prefer this over the A7S III's like mode dial. But I think the best mode switch design of all cameras is the A7 IV so far. So to the left of the mode switch we see a big microphone. So the camera comes with a dead cat, I think it's called. Can you say that in 2023? I don't know. It comes with a filter that you put on to the microphone that will help you to reduce wind noise and so on. And speaking of the microphone, that is one of the things that is very cool on this camera in my opinion. So this is what the internal microphones of the ZV-E1 sounds like. And if you're like me and don't want to carry around an external microphone to the camera when you're out shooting wildlife, you will get way better results with this one directly out of camera than from the A7 IV, for example. So the size of this camera is probably for many people a very big perk, but typically in wildlife photography, people tend to like cameras a little bit bigger, so they're easier to grab onto. Personally, I will have this camera as a second film camera, and the A7 IV being my primary photography camera. So having camera number 2 a bit smaller, and so it doesn't take up a lot of space in the camera bag, is very, very nice. So I really like the size of this thing. So why I even decided to make this video is because of the video specs of this camera. So the dual base ISO at 640 and 12,800 is a game changer for me and many others that doesn't own the A7S III already. I was so lucky that I got to experience Northern Lights with my short little time frame that I have this camera. And filming Aurora in real time is an extremely hard task for a camera to do. You can see this, it's like pulsating right here. That is so cool. Wow! I was not ready for this. So what is lighting me up right now is the record light that is like this tiny. So we're at ISO 80,000 right now, so the sensor is very sensitive to light. It's insane. And since I didn't have any moonlight, I had to crank up the ISO to between 80,000 and 100,000. That is insanely high. And that we're even able to see what's going on is just amazing in my opinion. But what is a dual base ISO? So in very basic terms, so every digital camera sensor has an ISO value where it will perform the best in noise levels, dynamic range, and image quality. And the camera sensor with a dual base ISO has two of them. On this camera, if you're shooting an S-Log3, those two are ISO 640 and ISO 12,800. So here you can clearly tell how the noise is just disappearing when we're reaching 12,800 ISO. Isn't this just amazing? And this, my friends, is one of the big reasons I'm getting this camera. Because most wildlife is active at dusk or dawn, and owls are nocturnal, so they're active at night, which means having a camera that is good in low light conditions is an absolute game changer. So in my FX30 review, I mentioned that when shooting in 4K 120p, the footage turns out pretty noisy on a cloudy day, especially when paired with a lens like the 200-600 because of the aperture of 6.3. But with this camera, this is far from a problem, thanks to the dual base ISO. But speaking of 4K 120p, this thing will be able to shoot at 4K 120 with no crop. However, this feature is not enabled on this unit I have right here and will roll out in a software update at a later state. So I guess we just have to take Sony's word on it. But the 4K 60p works very good and it has no crop as the A7 IV does. I'm really excited for that feature as well, but the crop we see on A7 IV can be a perk for many wildlife photographers because many times you just want to reach as far as you can to be and still be able to create 4K video. But using clear image zoom on this will get you similar results to a cropped frame, but things like bird eye autofocus is disabled when using the clear image zoom. So as you know, AI is taking over the world. Sony has now implemented a dedicated AI processing unit inside of the camera. And they have added a couple of stabilizing features that this unit powers. So now we have the dynamic active mode, which will identify the subject and crop around the subject to make a stabilized video. And we also have the human posture estimation mode, where the camera will automatically frame a person inside of the image. We also have a new feature called auto framing, and it is what you expect when you hear the name of it. So when having the camera fixed on a tripod, it will locate the subject and frame it inside of a cropped image, and it will track the subject around the frame, just as a videographer would stand there and like film you. And for somebody like me, being out alone filming myself every day, this is a very cool feature. But does it work for wildlife and birds? Yes, it does. And another new thing is the Cinevlog, which will make your vlogs look like the movies by adding black bars to the footage. However, those black bars are burnt into the footage. But honestly, I don't feel it's super relevant to wildlife and nature filming anyways. This camera, you can import your own LUTs to it and have it as an overlay when you're shooting an S-Log3. And I think the inbuilt LUT in this thing looks very good and is very accurate to what you want to shoot. And I find this very, very good when shooting in S-Log, because looking at a flat like profile, it doesn't look good and it's hard to set the right exposure. So I can highly recommend to use a LUT overlay if you get this camera to be able to get your footage the way you want it to look like, basically. So when you're out capturing wildlife, you are obviously outside. So I asked Sony about the weatherproofing on this thing, and they said that it's designed to be dust and moisture resistant, but not dust and moisture or waterproof. But I tend to use rain covers anyways, just to be safe. So is this camera good for any photography work? I tried to snap some shots with it, and the photos turn out like I imagined them to be. Like 12 megapixels, you cannot crop anything really, and like the image quality is good, like the dynamic range and so on looks very, very good, but it's not a photography camera, so I wouldn't buy this if your main goal is to do photography, obviously. So something I immediately noticed when picking up this camera is that we now have some new autofocus modes. So the camera can now recognize insects, airplanes, cars and trains, but what I'm most excited about is the ability that you can choose the camera to look for bird's eyes and animal eyes at the same time, so you don't have to switch between them. That will come very handy, I know, because I've missed out a lot of times on the A7 IV. Just suddenly you have a bird sitting close to you and you're in animal eye autofocus, for example. This thing will do both, so I'm very glad to see it on this one. And the autofocus in video works very good. It's snappy and correct, and I find it pretty similar to my A7 IV in video, and I haven't really had any issues with it. I'm happy with the performance so far, but I'm looking forward to try it out in a longer period of time. And something I've come to love with this thing is under menu, we find the main tab, or yes, we have main 1 and 2. And here you can very easily see all of the settings, and you can easily change all the settings with just a tap. And it's a great overview of every single setting that you need to change. Super nice to see, and I hope again we see this on all the different cameras later, because I don't think I can live without this now that I've tried it. Something also worth mentioning is that on the other alpha cameras you have the memory recall settings, and I'm a big fan of those. It's basically presets for the camera settings, and those are dedicated to a hardware button on alpha cameras. On this, it's inside of the menu system, so you have to go in the menus and click through to get to it. I guess I will get used to it, but I am a big fan of hardware buttons when I'm out in the field. So just as on the A7S III, this camera performs really good in terms of a rolling shutter performance. So here's a direct comparison between the A7 IV and the ZV-E1, and you can clearly tell the difference here. So capturing fast-moving subjects and panning back and forth with this thing will not be a problem. And I would say it is a bit of a problem on the A7 IV. So in the end, you know your needs best. And so do you need a viewfinder, or do you need the full-sized HDMI that the A7S III has? Or do you need the mechanical shutter? And if you answered yes to those questions, I guess the A7S III is the better choice for you. And the FX30 is an amazing APS-C camera for the money. And I've made a video on how that camera performs at doing wildlife and nature filming as well. So make sure to check that out up here if you're interested. But if you have the money, I would go for a full-frame sensor like this, since most wildlife is active at dusk and dawn. So if your main goal is to shoot wildlife with this thing, you will probably be very satisfied with it. And it basically does the key things as the A7S III does, but in a smaller form factor. The A7S III is now 3 years old, I think, and it ain't getting younger. But the A7 III is also more of a workhorse because of the ability to have 2 SD card slots and faster memory cards, the CF Express Type A ones. This only has a regular SD card, and also because of the overall build quality of the A7S III. So I guess it comes down to what you prefer in usability and what you're going to use it for. So the reason I will be getting this camera is because of the low light capability as well in filming wildlife, as well as the upcoming 4K 120p features. So this, and the fact that it's made for vlogging, makes it the perfect choice for me as a content creator. So what are your thoughts? Are you getting this camera? And what are you planning to shoot with it? tell me in the comments. I will see you in the next video. Thanks a lot for sticking with me. Adios, bye.